Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer. Michael Wan is with me, and this is Project Kids number 12. It's been a little while since we've done something for YouTube. We've still been creating a lot of content, but a lot of it is over on patreon.com/offplanetmedia at the Project Kids level. So if you enjoy our content and would like to interact with us and see additional content to what's here on YouTube, head on over there and you will find lots of it. Michael, welcome back. How you doing?
I am well. Thank you for having me. I got a question for you. This just popped in my head as you were talking. Like, when did content, I understand that as a term, you being able to describe what people do when they put it on the internet machine. But when did that become the term? It almost it doesn't feel appropriate for what it is we do. Oh, we're creating content. That almost sounds we're creating more than content, ladies and gentlemen. And I get where they use it, but I want to come up before the end of the show. I'll see if I could come up with a better word, or maybe you could come up with a better word for what it is that we're creating.
I think, I have something. I think that you and I do a couple of things. I think we play with mysteries, so we simultaneously uncover them and build them. It isn't just a one-way thing, right? Because we sort of discover things and then we sort of imagine some pieces into it to sort of, right? So it's kind of uncovering and building mysteries, riffing on realities, making things up and seeing them come true anyway. A lot of the things we do, I'd say are interesting syncs. They're up to the moment, synchromysticism, but it not some putting together some stories of old to do it. It's kind of at the current moment.
Yeah, real time. Yeah. I was thinking about this earlier today. I was talking to one of my sons, and was explaining synchronicity as an idea. And what was popping in my head as I was doing that is, so synchronicity as a term is accredited to Carl Jung, right? So when was he alive? The 50s, maybe? I think that was his time frame when he was doing a lot of his work. Were there no synchronicities before that? Or did we not have a word for it? And then how did the introduction of the word, change? Now that obviously, I don't think that there weren't synchronicities, but we did not have human beings then did not have the lexicon to use it to describe what they were experiencing. So maybe it did not take so much form.
So kind of like what we've experienced with false flags and Mandela effects and stuff like that. Once there's a term for them, you can find them everywhere. But before
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Oh, so let's, and then this is kind of when I guess why I was questioning content. I'm that's someone else's term, but that's not what we're doing. But you're right about this introduction. I was just talking about this yesterday. I don't know if you in Southern California probably, was not on your radar, pun the soon to be clear pun, but a couple years ago, they started talking about these things in winter called polar vortexes. They're there's a polar vortex. And I'm saying to everyone I know, I was there's never been a word called polar vortex before. I'm 45 years old. I've watched the news, the weather for a long time, and they've never friggin' said polar vortex. This is made up bullshit. It's an actual phenomenon maybe, but how these introductions of words, for better or for worse, it constructs the reality. And one more example to think about this is deja vu. Deja vu, we don't even have an English word for it. We had to go into French to describe it. And so maybe more as as I said before, the content, we're not creating content. We need to come up with new words to describe these things, because as those words are, even if it's just our lexicon and the people who are watching this, then it takes form. And this, my friend, is the first paragraph of the glass bead game. That's what they literally say. Conscientious thinkers need to start talking about things that do not exist in serious form.
And the glass bead game is something that Michael and I have been examining and we'll be talking about increasingly as we go on here. I think I can explain the polar vortex thing to you, right?
Oh, hit me.
So that is a real thing, right? We live in a world where the poles are entrances to an inner Earth, right? And one sort of comes down and one goes up, right? And so the polar vortex would maybe explain the book Inside the Earth or the world beyond the poles, or some of the things we talk about when we're talking about a different way of envisioning the reality that we live in. And that idea has become increasingly popular in the last few years. And so when people go searching for polar vortexes, they don't want them to find this discussion about the alternative perspectives on what the Earth may or may not be. They want them to think it's a weather phenomenon, right? So that's why they're using it over and over.
Right. And at the same time, it is a demonstration of the growth in consciousness of like the greater humanity. Okay, now like this is going to be a topic now. And so now there has to be the inversion of it, the inversion term.
And the same thing happened when people started to paying attention to what BLM was, the Bureau of Land Management, when the Bundy Ranch stuff happened. When people started they didn't want people to know about the Bureau of Land Management. So very quickly they hatched a social movement that they wanted people to pay attention to called Black Lives Matter, and they hashtag that BLM.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about this before, and those groups have shown up to be ideologically like opposed, like the people who would have and I'm being kind of like general when I say this, but like, the sort of person, the sort of consciousness that would be interested in like what was going on with the Bureau of Land Management and what was going on up in Oregon. They are diametrically opposed of the sort of consciousness that would be drawn into the social movement known as Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And so those were they were inversions all along. Yep. And as I've gone on record saying before, and that is the conjuring of the one of the primary demons in the Book of Demons, who goes by the initials of BLM.
Yes, the Balam, absolutely.
All right. Either way, it's being invoked.
All right, so it seems that wordplay is the order of the day here in the first hour. So
all right.
Right, that seems like we're already off down that.
Undoubtedly. And what's funny is because we talked before, like, a little bit behind the scenes for the folks watching, like, this is how you make the sausage, is we talk about, like, right before we start recording. So what do you want to talk about? I'm like, I don't know. What do you want to talk about? Well, this. And then as soon as you hit play, like something happens, which is not in the atmosphere prior, or as soon as you hit record, it is not in existence. Like this whole thing, like we weren't discussing this 5 minutes ago, but as soon as you said record, like it came alive.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So you and I we always chat a lot in the background, and this idea of like wordplay has been a topic in relation to Seder squares, in relation to like reversing and moving around of letters and words to sort of rearrange, to sort of disguise what they actually are and what they mean. And then just before we started, you started talking a little bit about palindromes in terms of the word and the movie Tenet, but also in terms of this very strange 10 days that we're in right now. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So do we want to talk about that?
So we can, if that's what you want, or whatever, or what.
Yeah. So let's go into that. So what day is today? Today is January 21st. Is that the day which they're telling us? Which
1/21/21. Yeah.
When you really start thinking about like, well, what do you mean you're telling me this is the date? But anyway, so this is the day we agreed. So the number of that is 1/2/1/2/1. January 21st, 2021. 2021. We dropped the 20. And this began yesterday. We began a 10 consecutive day calendar palindrome. So the 20th. So every time, like the second digit of the day, 21, 22, 23, that's the center point of the palindrome. But the 1-2 is the bookends, if you will. And so that in itself, like, people always get into like the dates and like the numerology and the dates on that level. But this is a unique one. And I think I read somewhere like this happens, like next time this will happen will be like in 100 years or, not in the immediate time frame. But then when we put that in context with the fact that we started talking about Tenet and Tenet being a palindrome, and like at no point did I have like, when I introduced that into our conversation, that like the word play Tenet then ties into the number play. And we all know that like alphanumeric codes, like numbers and letters, they're exchangeable. And then it was bookmarked in the changing of the guard of Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And, that's always been part of, or at least in the past year, I've a year and a half is when like the whole Joe Biden story, I've incorporated that into like kind of, you know, the stories which I tell. So it's like there has been this perfect like coming together of the palindrome, and like, you know, I don't know what that means, but we can recognize it, that it's significant, which then I think tells us to go looking a little bit deeper.
Okay, so I have some thoughts as to how those things connect. The movie
All right.
Tenet, the movie Tenet, the idea of palindrome, both as a word, which is what Tenet is, but also in some ways describes what's happening in Tenet. This 10-day period we're in with the numbers, like you said, right? And then
Yeah, 10 and Tenet, we got to include that.
right? And then Joe Biden and how does he kind of come into this, right? So now I watched Tenet as well, and also there was a lot of discussion for me in the months before I actually watched it, because my friend Jeff, who I do a lot of stuff with, was very obsessed with this movie and the idea of being presented there in terms of reality alteration to a certain extent, right? And so what he explained to me long before I got a chance to watch the movie, that what we're being shown in that movie is what's called a temporal pincer movement.
Okay? Yeah, that's a phrase in the movie.
Temporal pincer movement, and that the action that they're doing when they're doing the temporal, when there's a temporal pincer movement, they're going in there to perform a quote unquote heist, right? Which kind of thing, like they basically are going in there and shifting something, you know, like taking and changing it or whatever it is in that 10 minutes. What if like what we're in right now with these 10 days is a temporal pincer movement, where the ability for things to be shifted around, like let's just say for the sake of discussion that like it's like Tenet, and there's another reality where time moves in the opposite direction, right? Kind of thing, like which basically what is happening in Tenet, right? There's another reality where time is going the other way, where bullets fly, you know, the other way, where everything is inverted, right? It's basically when they go over to the other side, they're inverted and they have to be careful with their long, you know, the air and all that kind of stuff. So we're in this 10-day period, and it's literally represented by the numbers, right? Like if you're into numbers, it's represented that that's what this would be, where basically changes can be made to realities, right? So where we may be, you know, like experiencing people coming into this reality to shift things around, but it's entirely possible that people who are from this reality are going to another and making changes as well. So we make this palindromic date anomaly that we're in right now may be incredibly significant for the ultimate direction of not only our world, but another world that exists right, you know, maybe right the next one over from ours, kind of thing, right? And so Jeff even mentioned to me when talking about like what happened at the Capitol a few weeks ago, that like somebody he talked to thought it was a heist, right? Thought that basically a kind of thing like what happened in Tenet is what happened there at the Capitol, right? That there was all of this sort of chaos created, kind of like in the movie when they do the airplane going into the building, right? There creates all this chaos and activity so that something can go in and something can be shifted, right? Right? Something can be changed. There's a lot of chaos. We still haven't figured out who those people, like there was people in there that look a lot like the same people we saw like at the Boston bombing, right? With all in black with their backpacks and their hat and whatever. We see some of these people at some of these events. Like, are these the heist performers kind of thing, or whatever is equivalent to that? Now, I watched this movie for some reason, like I don't know, like, you know how sometimes you're rolling through like on Netflix or Prime or whatever you watch shit, and for some reason, like even though it doesn't make any sense why this would appeal to you, you're like, I'm supposed to watch this and I'm supposed to watch this right now. I watched this fake, it was called, they literally described it as a fake documentary, right? A fake documentary called The History of Time Travel. And this was a very interesting movie that I recommend that you and everybody else watch, because I think that there's a huge amount of truth presented in there, right? So we all know that documentaries at this point are propaganda and mostly bullshit. But a fake documentary that is also actually poorly acted, probably intentionally, like might contain some truth, right? We're at that level of inversion. And in this movie, the time travel machines, basically, that was the center of all of this controversy that was created around it, was housed in a backpack, and the person who was time traveling had to wear the backpack with the time travel machine in it. Right.
It's very Boston Marathon.
very Boston Marathon, but also these people that have not been identified at.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah. This, which are the same people. So when I say that, like Boston Marathon, I'm referring to all of those players.
Yes, right. So I mean, so that's what's, you know, so that's kind of my thoughts about, like, maybe we saw a temporal pincer moment there at the Capitol, right? That all this chaos was created around. And then right now, like, we're in some, so that's a possibility. And then also there's the possibility that we're in this weird zone, sort of between realities right now, where things are flowing both forward and backward. Like generally in Tenet, I think the way that they produced it in the graphic about that I saw about it was like one side was red, one side was blue. And then when you're in these little, like those locked zones, those like sealed rooms that they go through to pass between, that's like the purple area, right? Kind of thing. Maybe we're in a purple area where time is flowing both ways for this 10 days.
All right. So the first thing I'm going to say is I saw the headlines of this article, how I think it was Kamala Harris, maybe Joe Biden's wife, and maybe it was like Michelle Obama, but it was a third woman, and about how they all had agreed to wear purple. Like their jackets were all purple for whatever reason. So I'm like, listen, I'm putting that in context of what you're just saying.
And remember, over this summer with all the George Floyd protests, they were referring to it as purple rain, right? Like there was all those people wearing the purple rain shirts. And if you remember, so you have Minneapolis there, you have a river running through it, you have St. Paul on one side, Minneapolis on the other, and we were using that at one of the conspiracy cocktails to talk about this, like, you know, like this sort of like purple zone. On one side would be red, on one, so St. Paul's more conservative, Minneapolis is more, you know, liberal and whatever, and then you have this river in the middle, right? And you think of rivers as being time, right? You think of like large,
right.
like that, like Gorodachi and all of that kind of stuff, right? So, I mean, this purple, we are in, you know, for many, many years now, since really the death of Prince. And remember, they made the Niagara Falls purple, and they made that beer called Purple Rains, and the Queen was wearing a purple hat and all purple and whatnot. And now we have these people there wearing purple. And I know Robert for sure thinks that like what we're in right now as a country is like a color revolution, like what they do, you know, what George Soros does in the other countries. Right. And it's the color for this one is purple.
Yeah.
And maybe this is this maybe the main weapon being used in this revolution is temporal distortion or temporal flow or something like that.
Yeah. So I want to comment on that, but I first want to say one thing on the Minneapolis. And this is really just kind of like an asterisk, and I'll probably want to come back, but when I say it, I'll remember it. So I talked a little bit, I think I shared with you about the 57 and how that has shown, particularly this time last year. And then where it showed itself again this year was on December 31st, 2020, for like 3 days or 2 days. There was a big story about the pharmacist who purposefully destroyed 57 vaccine vials of the Moderna vaccine. Mm-hmm. So he's from Minneapolis as well. And I've been asking myself for a week, I forgot that the George Floyd began in Minneapolis.
And Prince was also from Minneapolis.
So we've got Prince as well from that. And then, but specifically, I don't remember if it was the town or no, I think it was the company which this pharmaceutical, the pharmacist worked for. He worked for a company called Aurora Healthcare.
Of course. Yeah.
Of course. So Aurora, we've got like, we've got like the multiple layers, like one, an actual Aurora Borealis, which is like, what the hell is that? The second one, which is like your polar vortexes, right? There's your polar vortex, the Aurora Borealis. Right. And then we have like the double entendre of how, the Joker from the Batman shootings, like the actual, like, the
that was in Aurora.
We need to have different terms to talk about what level of theater we're talking about, where the James Holmes, that was in Aurora, Colorado. Mm-hmm. And then And then we
By the
have,
way, there was also reports of those same kind of characters, and I don't
exactly the
yeah.
same things. And then we have, and this ties back to Wayne's World, because Wayne's World took place in Aurora also. And we did the whole conversation of how Wayne's World was like, you know, tied into all of the British security coordination and all of that,
That was
stuff.
Aurora, Illinois, right?
That was, yeah, that was Aurora, Illinois. But again, like we're seeing Aurora.
Was the city in the movie Contagion, was that Minneapolis too that they lived in?
It may have been. It may have been, because if I recall, I'm gonna pull that up right now.
I know it was someplace snowy. Yeah.
There were a couple different settings in Contagion, and now that I think about it, that does sound right. Like they had to go there. It says, "Run in Hong Kong." The plot, Minneapolis.
Yep.
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 2 days later, back home in suburban Minneapolis. So yes, Minneapolis is exactly. That was a key location. Dr. Erin Mears has very Emily sounding quality to it, the EM. But yeah, she goes to Minneapolis. So Minneapolis is definitely on our map.
And then also there's a doctor, I think his name is, I might be getting it wrong, I think it's like Scott Jensen or something like that, who has been repeatedly in trouble, but every time he's been proven not to, you know, like they don't suspend him. They keep people keep reporting him to the board in Minnesota. I think he's from Minneapolis, who's been saying from the very beginning about all the problems with the testing and the way the COVID's being reported and whatever. He also is from that area in Minnesota as well. So, and that would be, he looks like he could be 57 years old. So that would be it.
Let me go and hit this for a second. So that's real. So this Minneapolis, like what's going on? So what's going on in Minneapolis? And then Aurora Borealis, or no, I'm going to do Polar Vortex. Polar Vortex. Let's see what we got. I spelled that Minneapolis, showing results for. Even crazier things that happened. All right, so there's something there, but then let's go back to where you were saying. So I didn't mean to go take off topic. I want to go back to the idea which you're presenting of what we witnessed in the Capitol, and then maybe maybe that was the setup for this moment. Like, I mean, if you imagine this, like if you imagine being like an orchestrator, a conductor of the main ARG, which we're experiencing, and so I'd say the primary ARG for humanity is what they're broadcasting over the primary media outlets, right? That doesn't mean it's the only one. That's the one which has like the most. So that was all set up to occur. Like that was the overture, the introduction, the preface of these 10 days. And what you're saying, like I didn't think about the what's going on right now in what happened at the Capitol along the same lines of the Tenet, what's it called? A pincher?
A temporal pincer movement.
A temporal pincher movement. But what I went into is the fact that there are two incidences that I knew for certain in the movie where they're telling us that that these were actual time travel events, but probably the better terminology I should have used was temporal pincher events, and that being 9/11. And we know they're telling us that with the plane crashing into the hangar. That is, everyone's seen that before. Where have you seen that before? In your imagination, when you imagine the planes crashing into the Pentagon. This is what you imagined it to look like, because you never saw anything, but that's what you pictured. And then they had the gold, and then the Saab scene in Norway, that corresponded just with the Norway spiral, because they stopped making that. They stopped making. They stopped. So what they're telling us, and this is what. Let me just put like a marker on this. I'm rewatching Interstellar, and it is very evident in the very beginning that Nolan is likening himself to, whether this is like, grandiose or whether he's like telling you the truth, but he's saying that he's the current Stanley Kubrick. Mm-hmm. And how do I know that? It is because the way the cinematography is, where they show the spinning thing in the space station in the sky, is exactly from 2001: Space Odyssey. And the quality of the music. There is this scene where, like, in the very beginning of the movie, where the Matthew McConaughey character says something, and the music in the background, no, it shows him looking out a window, and I'm like, this is exactly inspired by the type of music which they had in Space Odyssey. Like, I just have a good ear for similar patterns of music. And then in the scene in the beginning where Matthew McConaughey goes into the school of his daughter, and the teacher tells him that she brought in an old history book and it's showing pictures of the moon landing. He's like, well, what's the big deal about that? She's like, because we're telling the corrected history, which is the moon landing was just a propaganda exercise during the Cold War. Like, this is the whole Stanley Kubrick motif.
Right. Yeah,
and so he's telling us, and so we know that Kubrick in the film, or not Kubrick, Nolan, which is almost a palindrome, is telling us there in the movie before in Interstellar that, you know, hey, I'm the next Kubrick, and now we're going to go and look at Tenet, which came out in this year, and that I'm doing a mea culpa in the same way The Shining supposedly is, like, telling all of these sort of events, and his events are about, like, the time travel. But the thing is, Nolan is very, very pro military industrial complex for whatever reason. Like, all of his films, like the heroes are all, like, you know, the main character in Tenet, he's a CIA spy, and Batman, his family made their money because they were defense contractors. Like, it's all this sort of stuff. So, like, is it a limited hangout or not? I don't know. But nonetheless, is when we look at those two events, which I just indicated, and then look at the timing of the movie, or at least the timing of when I saw it, you know, you and I seem to be the only ones who are talking about this in this way, or at least we're adding to Jeff's points. It seems like Jeff already started talking about it. Like, yeah, this is like, so we know what we're looking at right before the Tenet Palindrome Seder Square kicks off. And that's where we are right now.
So I would say that while Nolan isn't a palindrome, Nolan is the kind of word that could be used in a Seder square. The Seder square, the words that are in them are almost, some of them are almost palindromes, but with one letter difference and whatnot,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So you could probably—
Yeah, Tenet's the only word which is a true palindrome, correct?
Maybe.
Yeah. I'm looking at it right here. Look, I'm working on this. I'm making my own.
Oh, nice. I like it. I like it.
This from a piece of stone from, like, that really, really strange, from that strange part of the Susquehanna.
Yeah.
And you could see these tiny little crystals on there. That came from a friend of mine who's a sound healer who has those crystal bowls. One of those crystal bowls, like, which he used for a long time, shattered, and he gave me all of those crystals. And I'm using that in here. Cool. Interestingly, his name is Asa. I talked about this in one of my videos, and then someone pointed out, oh, the corners of the Seder Square are ASA. So Asa's name is actually in it. So, like, you know, it works on many levels. But go on. So where are you going with Nolan and, like?
Okay, so I just wanted to point out that is, you could probably make a Seder Square with that one somewhere inside of it, and that maybe that's some of the code here. Okay, let me think. There was something that came up that I wanted to say. I kind of lost my thought on that for a second. So, for Jonathan Nolan is Christopher Nolan's brother, and Jonathan Nolan made that television series called Person of Interest.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Jonathan Nolan, so go on.
I highly recommend you watch Person of Interest. It's very pertinent. But that was can you look up I think it was Jonathan Nolan and J.J. Abrams. Right, J.J. Abrams is another one of these who makes these pro-military industrial complex theories and movies, but also does an incredible amount of revelation of the method and clues and stuff like that. He did Fringe, he did Lost, he did, you know, Person of Interest. He's done but he also does Star Wars, right? He's also, like, doing the modern Star Wars and stuff like that. So they're kind of similar in that sense. They have their own unique styles. They're similar. As far as do you know where Interstellar was filmed? And you know,
I know it takes place in Texas, but I don't know where it was filmed.
I'd be interested to know, because all the Stanley Kubrick stuff, the 2001: Space Odyssey, was supposedly filmed here in the middle of Laurel Canyon at Lookout Mountain Laboratory, right? Which is now, I believe Jared Leto lives there now, and he's an interesting character.
Yes, he is.
But
Time
the
travel.
Lookout Mountain Laboratory is right there in the middle of like where all that activity that Dave McGowan talks about in reference to Laurel Canyon sort of took place. So it would be interesting to know where Interstellar was actually filmed, and then kind of, you know, maybe
Alberta, Iceland, and Los Angeles
is what
for Interstellar.
Interstellar was done in Los Angeles as well, right? So it was filmed in Los Angeles, Alberta, and Iceland. Where and what about? Can you check about Person of Interest? I think it was Jonathan Nolan and J.J. Abrams.
They also
It-
did Westworld together.
And they also do Westworld together, which Westworld
Right.
also the end point of it is sort of here in Los Angeles, right? So this is also very pro military industrial complex, but also revelation of the method and lots of nuggets of truth. So there is something. Okay, so like I'd say those three are, I'd classify them all together with each their own unique style, right? But they're doing basically the same thing. Right. So my guess would be that like maybe they're kind of like us, that they have a background kind of like us, and they decided to go this more corporate route where they're willing to, you know, push certain ideas or justify or glorify certain things. And maybe it's in the service of truth, or maybe it's mockery or whatever it is. But I do think that there's, you know, I've discovered a lot of answers in their work.
Right.
A lot of stuff, and I think it could be coded for certain people to understand and really find very big truths. But for most of the people, they'll just get the propaganda aspect and the predictive programming aspect of it. Right? They're looking at it in different ways. So yeah, so you may want to take a look at some of those TV shows that I mentioned, because they're really interesting, and you may pull from it different things than I have.
Right.
I need to go back and watch Interstellar again. I watched Interstellar. That Tesseract that he's in, like, it reminded me of something that I've referred to as like the hall of memories kind of thing. Like, you know, and it's basically like I have a memory of like something that I don't know if it was a projection or a real place that I was in as a kid, where like you would walk down the hall and like each room was like a memory from your life, and you could look at that, and then you could walk to a different room and you could go into it and walk around and move around inside of it. Right. And so like, and when he was doing that stuff inside the Tesseract and the bookcase and whatever, it was like a similar thing, just a different, you know, like it was basically like that. I was like, that's the hall of memories.
Yeah. When you say that, like, it just it gives me a flashback of a memory, one of my childhood memories, not exactly that context, but about being in a hallway, a strange hallway, and like, you know, now I'm thinking about that a little bit differently. I want to go back and have you flesh out a little bit more of, I'm still confused what the phrase temporal pincer movement.
Mm-hmm.
I looked into that briefly when I was doing a little bit of the Tenet research, and what I remember seeing was like it's an actual like a military strategy of flanking on two sides.
Right.
And like that's as far as I went with it. But my sense is, like, as you know, like, you know, these are word plays, and it's referring to like that might be an archetype which can then be expressed in other ways. So what do we think, like, what do we think happened? And what are we in right now? Like, you know, let's put this in real context, is like, you know, what's going on? Like,
So,
what can, like, you and me as active players in this ARG, we've got like all of the indications of like some key points. Minneapolis, we've got some numbers. But most importantly, we know we're in the right time. What would we do with like a pincher movement?
all right. So the way I envision what it looks like, right? So from the military strategy, let's assume that like when we talk about the general military strategy of it, right? That we're in one reality where there's linear time, right? But they have an area where they want to create like a capsule where they can completely control the environment for a period of time. And so they approach it and kind of create like a zone. And whether they do this with frequency weaponry, or whether they just do it with like controlling the battle space coming into both sides of this physical area that they want to sort of control for a period of a certain amount of time, it creates like this space in between.
Bubble.
And then when it becomes where I think we are now, like in the movie and this more advanced reality, I think we're already living in, or that we're kind of crossing over right now, where there's multiple realities at play with this. It also happens this way. So it's a lateral movement and a horizontal vertical movement that allows crossover between the different spaces. But what I think you're doing is you're creating like a space, like boundaries, coordinated certain boundaries, right? That where basically when you're inside of that temporal and physical space is captured for a period of time, right?
Mhm.
No natural flow going into it, right? Everything in there is sort of, maybe the boundaries are created by sound or by space, or by, I think there's many ways to sort of figure that out. But within that space, it's completely separated from the influence of whatever's outside of it.
Right.
Right. And
would you say that's what we're in right now because of the calendar, or do you think, are you just saying that happened within the events in the Capitol?
So like the way, okay, so I'm just making this up. I'm not saying
right. But I'm going to ask you pointed questions because you're tapped into something
that may have been
now.
like a small version, right? Like maybe let's say it was a 10-minute thing, right? That like whatever that 10 minutes, there was like a 10 minutes of it went on for a couple of hours seemingly, but all of the big activity that involved the shooting and the crazy shit, that seemed to happen pretty quick. Like maybe that was 10 minutes, right? Like, maybe that didn't go on for that long, really, the highest chaotic moment of it, right? And then now there's like a 10-day period, right?
Right.
One of the things that's been interesting and people have been trying to figure out what the fuck this shit's all about, and you can find various like ways people have talked about it, is this circle that was created around DC, right? Where nobody was allowed in and out. They weren't allowing any traffic into or out of it. Like maybe, right? And there's National Guard guarding that area around DC. Right.
And the airspace for like the week before was completely like, if you've seen any of those satellite images of the air traffic, for like all of the DC airspace was shut down for a week.
Right. So
all commercial flights had to go around.
Right. So there was nothing happened in Washington. And remember, there was also Biden canceled his inauguration rehearsal 2 times.
Okay.
Right. And, which is weird, right? Like, A, why do you need a rehearsal for something that is like hardly even an event? But B, like, that's weird that kept happening. So my question is like, what's really been going on in that space that the National Guard was guarding for all of this time? Are we dealing with a scenario where there has been some kind of technology deployed, right? That has, sort of changes what this is? I mean, Washington, D.C. is weird anyway, because essentially you have another country inside of a country, right? Just like the Vatican and London and whatnot, right? And so like, and it's a 10-mile square space, which is also 10. So we have 10 minutes, 10 days, and it's a 10-mile space.
I've lived in that in that square too.
Me too. I've lived there as well, right?
You lived in the square?
I lived in Washington, D.C. Yeah.
Oh, so you were in the square as well. I was in the Arlington side, which is on the other side of the river. We're like thinking about this differently now. Is like, I'm like, particularly as you related to like St. Paul and Minneapolis, like, there are different qualities on the 2 sides of the river, but go on. So keep going down this line of thought.
Yeah. So like these are 3 different ways of creating a 10, something with the number 10. So we have like a 10-minute, a 10-mile, and a 10-day kind of thing. So
now we've got an X, Y, and a Z axis. You were first talking about like horizontal and vertical, but we also have depth.
And then I just did this interesting show last week with the Crimmies. I'll probably post it tomorrow or the next day, about projective geometry and vortices. We were like doing it as like a primer for this guy we're going to do a show on named Gabriel Kellerman, right? And basically they were showing me like how they showed me these grids, right? These like geometric grids. And I was like, oh my God, when I look at these, it makes me think of these events, right? Because where you focus, where you make a node, then it creates a new geometry off of that, right? And if you change where your focus in this grid is, it generates a different reality coming off of that, right? And so within these temporal spaces, they draw attention, right? These physical or temporal spaces, they create an activity in one location, right? That kind of generates an area of focus. Now that can be where the event is happening, or that can be to draw people away from where something else is being maneuvered over here, right? And so like, I think part of it is just creating, it's kind of like if you're making your graph, your grid on a piece of paper, or like, you know, when detectives start working on their case, they make a chalkboard or a wall and they start drawing the lines and connections and whatever, right? So when you set up boundaries, whether they're temporal, physical, or in this case with multiple dimensions, so almost cubic, right? Then like the way you kind of control your activity is by like looking at where, when you focus energy on this segment of the graph, what it does to the rest of the stuff on the paper, right?
Right.
Like where things are in relation to where like the focus of something is, right? And then you can start to, and this takes us in some ways to the glass bead game and the jeweled Indra's net and all of this kind of stuff, right? Everything is about perspective, right? And so like, I think, you know, this seems to me to be some sort of interactive technology that allows sort of domination of a particular space.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like, you know, like, and it is very much gamed out and gridded out, right? This like, you know, it's you know, and then they find players to play the roles, the characters, and in some cases, you know, we have characters that we all know, right? You have your Joe Biden and Lady Gaga was there and da 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 da. But in other cases, we have these like military characters that we don't know, and they're all dressed the same. Well, how do we know if one penetrated in from some other reality, right? Like they look like all the other ones, right? And so there's like things that you're focused on and things that you're not, because they look smaller and all the same, right? But anyone who can enter into the space has the ability to sort of change, right? To sort of change something on the other side of it. I don't know if I'm explaining it completely well enough correctly, right? But when you would watch them go into these temporal pincer movements in the movie, right? It was obvious that some of the people that were in that space knew what was going on and others didn't, right? So there's like players that are like aware of their role in the game and others that really aren't within that space, right? And I think that like, so what we witnessed the day of the Capitol, whatever they're calling it, there was people in there that knew what was going on, people that had no idea, people that were partially informed and whatever. But this thing that happened yesterday, like that was a completely controlled environment.
What happened yesterday?
The inauguration.
Oh, the inauguration.
There was like literally like no people in Washington, D.C. other than 25,000 troops and like the 8 people that were at the inauguration.
Did you, I watched like some of the highlights, and what I wanted to do was see the crowd. Did you see any crowd images?
I didn't see any crowd images. And
yeah, I mean, like for obvious reasons, they're not going to show it because there aren't any crowds, but I wanted to see what it looked like with no crowds, but nonetheless, go on.
I just saw a picture that looked like a few benches with like a few people sitting on them that were
like, right. It wasn't a wide angle, so you couldn't gauge what was there.
But remember, Donald Trump literally left Washington, D.C. like earlier in the day. He didn't just like leave the White House. He left Washington, D.C. He left the square. He left the 10 miles, right? So he wasn't in whatever that boundary is.
Right.
We're not just talking about geographic. We're talking also about temporal depth, like many, like
right.
And so, you know, it's interesting. Like I've heard people in conversations that I think are mostly nonsense talk about like, okay, there was this circle around Washington, D.C., right? And on one side is one reality and on another side is another reality. Like in one side, like they're saying that like, oh, everything really is okay. And they ended the corporation, and inside Washington, D.C. is still that. But now outside of that is the sovereign Republic of the United States and whatever it is, right? But like there is clearly some demarcation that was being made, right? And you know, they know the obvious answer might be like the QAnon interpretation of it, right? But like literally, what if the boundaries were to protect an energetic zone that was going to be house the temporal pincer movement?
So then what was the heist?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the heist back on the Capitol Day, it was different, right? We know that something happened. We're in the 10 days still. I don't know if activity, like I think they're still under an emergency or no, everything's closed in Washington, D.C. for 10 days, right? So I don't, yeah.
So what's jumping out for me is or what I'm seeing is there are two events. And like both are arbitrary. And what I mean by that is like they're not naturally occurring. They're like set up by like a system. And so the first one being the more arbitrary, meaning like the more contrived, the more like something happened on the 7th. And I really like this, like something happened on the Capitol, just like what you're talking about. And it was like a preemptive event, or it was an event that happened before what was going to happen, which began on the 20th, which is slightly independent of the inauguration. And so this is the way I'm seeing it. So the reason what happened, which began on the 20th, which we are on day number 2 right now, which will extend for 10 days, is that it was built into the coding of our calendar.
Yes.
So really, so this where we are right now, it's arbitrary, and the arbitrariness goes back to the when the Gregorian calendar was put into place. Because this is like, that started it, and we're just in that. This is not the only time there have been palindromes in the date, but so that has happened. And so that there's a certain level of what you're describing in terms of like, there's an exchange which is capable between the layers of reality that happened during that time. And then in addition to that, which was going to happen, and this is the thing which I think is really important. So this time frame that we're in right now is for anyone who follows the calendar system. So like, I keep a calendar, you keep a calendar, that's all of us. Like, whether or not you might follow also like another calendar, whether you still follow like a Jewish calendar, you still follow like the Mayan calendar, but you still are grounded in the primary calendar of life on earth, which is this Gregorian calendar. We all have agency within that.
Mm-hmm.
Where everything which falls underneath that calendar, like, which is pretty much all of life, which is structured within this calendar system, we have play. And so this 10-day period, whatever is potential, and I'm not certain what that potential is, but let's just say like there's a potential that this window affords. All right. And that is free, and that's empowering to all of us who've got skin in that game. What happened on the 7th? Now that is different. Now that is a surgical strike. And the reason why that surgical strike happened, and when you're so right, like it was about eyeballs. Eyeballs does something to it. If you go back, and who really won from that was CNN, and what CNN represents. And CNN is owned by AT&T. And if you go down the AT&T history, but it's all of that energy and what that represents. But this was something else. And this was a preemptive, something happened. And that's why I'm like, well, what do you think the heist is? I'm being a little bit rhetorical because I think this is unfolding in our conversation as we're talking. But something happened then, and that was not an empowering movement. That was the heist. That was what Nolan was describing with like the 9/11 Stargate and all this other stuff. It's like, you were involved, you fed it, you witnessed it, but something else happened. And that, I think you're completely accurate in describing like the creation of this, like, it's more or less a temporal Faraday cage, which was created. And so like, if anything, so maybe this is making sense right now. What that has also done is to the consciousness of the people who are still engrossed in like, who could have done something or who can still do something, but you were tricked. Guess what? You're going to be focused here, and you're going to see a false story, and you're going to miss this opportunity. And this is what's really important now. So I want to be clear here. Like, I have, since as long as I've been 18, 100% rejected all political systems.
Yeah.
All of them. There's never been a moment. So like what I'm saying is not like from like, one political movement versus another, but I'm very interested in politics and very, very aware of the people who are involved and what they put into it. The people who were involved with the QAnon movement, they just had their hearts ripped out.
Yeah.
In the same way that the people were involved with the Hillary Clinton movement had their hearts ripped out.
Yep.
It's the same
Same
modus
exact thing.
operandi. So I
Yep.
want you to think about this, then I'll stop in a moment. So what happened before the Trump victory was that every Hillary supporter was told, and they believed it. They believed it with all of their heart. They were like, Hillary's going to win. Hillary's going to win. They were told over to all the polls show Hillary has such a huge lead. Everyone believed in their heart of hearts that their candidate was going to win. Same thing just happened to all the QAnon.
Totally. Exactly.
Up until the last moment. I saw this video on the 19th, which says DC is now in stage 2 of continuation of government, and this is what is going to happen. So to the very moment, and now there's this. So there's like a play on those two sides, but the bigger story is like we're in this 10-day thing right now. What we do with it, I don't know yet, but we're getting there.
Okay, so I had a thought while you were doing this, right?
Okay.
So think about what they even called that protest on was it on the 6th or the 7th?
Which one?
It was on the 7th? Okay. So
the one that just happened?
Yeah, they were calling it Stop the Steal, right? So what if literally that event was created to set up the scenario where there would be a reason why nobody is allowed into Washington, D.C. on January 20th, which begins this 10 days, right? They didn't want all those people coming into D.C. because this 10-day palindromic period, everything is rearrangeable, right? So they had, maybe even particularly in that space. So they created this event on the 7th, the Stop the Steal being, let's say the steal being the heist that one
right.
In these 10 days, we can steal reality back in these 10 days, maybe even in Washington, D.C. Like you and I, we can still steal reality, but for some people, their reality requires they have a government that they agree with in order to have the reality that they want back. So they literally don't want people in D.C. during this period of time. So they create this event, right, on the 6th or the 7th. 6th, it was on the 6th, that's what I thought. On the 6th, right, they create this event that creates the narrative as to why there can't be people there on the 20th, which is the beginning of this 10 days of palindromic, everything moving in both directions kind of reality.
Everything, time moving in both directions. Holy crackers. Okay, so then the question is, what do we do? Now we've got 9 more days. And
one more thing, remember before they would go into these spaces in Tenet, where like all this chaos would happen, remember how like time would really slow down for a second, and all of a sudden they're thrown into the space where everything has to do it really fast? But remember there was the slow down first? Remember what I told you when I got back from Austin? How everything felt so slow, like the time was moving so slowly, right? Like every day seems to be a week, and not in a bad way. We were having a great time, but it was like, wow, we have had time to do everything that we want to do, and extra time to wander around and diddle around and do stuff that I just, I enjoy having endless amounts of time. I don't like to be super time pressured and whatever, right? So this 10 days, maybe there's a different characteristic about time. And in that space, like if people had gone into that area during this time, maybe there really could have been a flipping of the government, right? Or a return to the Republic. I mean, I don't know. I don't care about this shit, right? But maybe that would have been up for grabs, just like we've been talking about the whole time we've been working together about reality being up for grabs. Maybe it's super up for grab in these 10 days, and they wanted to cordon off Washington, D.C. to make sure that reality wasn't up for grabs. So they created the context for that to happen by doing this event that they literally called Stop the Steal. They weren't talking about stealing the election. They were talking about stealing reality back.
Did we just hit 1 hour? Because I think right now is a good time to we'll reward the patrons to hear where this goes. Like that. Right, I think this is and here's the thing for the folks who's watching at home, none of this was planned, this conversation.
Nope, not at all. All right, guys, join us at patreon.com/offplanetmedia for the rest. We'll see you over there in just a minute. Bye-bye.